Da, 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 da. Middle Ages, Renaissance, and the Reformation, 30 years religious wars, absolutist monarchs. Now it's the Enlightenment, Locke and Hobbes and Dare to Know, factories, wood to coal, Industrial Revolution, cry for freedom, then resounds, Vive la France! Decamore and Italy, Garibaldi and the red shirts, Bismarck and Germany, the power behind the throne. Mania starts World War I, Russian Revolution. Then there's disillusionment in the world between the wars. Single party governments, Munich and appeasement. Hitler starts invading, World War II's begun. Covert tensions escalate, Russia-US conflict. Falling of the Berlin Wall, revolting satellite states. 57 EEC established common market. European unity, now it's modern day.
So before I go over liberalism, I want to kind of bring up a few questions for you to think about as we are covering all these different ideologies and isms. So with each of the isms, they have followers or leaders, and I want you to think about whether it's conservatism, liberalism, or nationalism. How successful were they able to achieve their goals? You know, after 1815, throughout this time period, going into the late 1800s, before the turn of the century, how successful were they? If they are supporting liberalism or nationalism, were they able to achieve the initial goals that they had? Okay. Second thing I want you to think about is specifically for this lecture and going into the next lecture on nationalism, why is it that a country like Great Britain was able to withstand or not even experience the types of revolutions that were happening on the continent? So keep that in mind, that Britain is kind of set apart in this time based upon the decisions, political decisions that will affect kind of the different social classes. Okay. All right. One other thing I want to kind of bring you back to is I didn't have the time, or I just forgot to go over this last part in Prussia. Okay, so if you go back to your 13A handout, just a few blurbs I want to just throw out there very quickly. Okay, so as far as how is there a German conservative presence in Europe after 1815? Basically, those that were liberal in Germany, in the German states, they really idolize Prussia because they are the leading German state as a leader of German liberalism, that a lot of liberal reforms would come through Prussian leadership. And so when the government started to put in reforms after defeating Napoleon, that's where the liberals just jumped in and says, oh yeah, like Prussia's doing the right thing, they're on the right track. So a lot of these reforms that they really instituted, though, were not with the intention to become more liberal in a political sense, but from the motivation and intention to improve efficiency in the government. So whatever administration and bureaucratic decisions and institutions, their goal was to be more efficient, to, I guess, make those reforms and changes, not for the sake of adopting liberalist values, but just more accepting that their government could be more efficient and kind of streamlining the processes within their government positions, okay, and policies. Lastly, and this is kind of like the driving point, is as the Prussian government is making these changes, they still support and work closely with the traditional ruling classes, which is the aristocracy, right? So the Junkers, along with the Prussian government, very much so would follow Metternich's lead, right? So Metternich, we know this is his age, his time to shine, and his goal to repress all liberal uprisings and different types of national revolutions and movements. The Prussian government and leadership, those that were in power, were very much in line with what Metternich wanted. So I'll be going over the impact of liberalism on Europe, and just really quickly, just for us to understand that the impact is really significant. As we look at the impact, then it tells us why the details really matter, because the outcome of it, is rather transformative in Europe, right? So it led to greater changes and events have happened. A lot of these facts, you don't really need to add too much about it because I just kind of like bullet pointed it out for you. But generally, just to see, okay, what was the overall effect and impact of liberalism as a philosophy? Well, for one example, France will have its own revolutions in 1830 and 1848. We'll be watching Les Mis that's focused upon the revolution in 1830. And they are not the only ones, right? So there are other revolutionary movements that were inspired by the philosophies and the values of liberalism, really demanding rights for the individual, right, and recognition for individuals to have those privileges by the government. And so throughout the 19th century, this is a big time where there's a lot of political changes, and even going to the 20th century later on too. Okay. As far as what's happening in the German states, the German Confederation is going to take a lot of liberalist values and kind of extract those values and input them into the different constitutions that they would write. So in the 30 some years, okay, between 1815 and 1848, they've written over 10 constitutions, and they've really, started to integrate these ideas. And as you can see, that it's really a work in progress. I mean, the fact that you have so many different revolutions happening, just new movement and new movement, fighting that's happening, demanding for change, and the requirement to not just add amendments to your constitution, but to create new constitutions just shows that the change is not significant enough to the way that people want it or demanding it. So, okay, so a lot of German student organizations are going to be the ones that are leading it. I mentioned how a lot of universities, for example, like in Austria, are also going to be inspired. This is, where people are reading and discussing and studying up all these different new writings that are happening. And so Prussia, as being the leading German state, later is going to be that place, that hub where a lot of these ideas are going to be generated from, and eventually German nationalism is definitely going to come through the Prussian state as well. Okay, and lastly, second to last, Great Britain is going to have a lot of reform measures, which I'll go over. 1830s is that critical time, and it's really interesting as we talked about, the dual revolution, right? With the Industrial Revolution, French Revolution. At the same time as the continent's going through its own revolutions again, right? Post 1815, Britain's going through its own changes, but it's very much more gradual in reforms. Okay. Lastly, Russia. We talked about how they're very much in a type of tug of war between those that are loyal to the monarchy and those that are starting to believe that Western style government and reforms are better, right? There's some change, the monarch wants to bring some development to the country, but nothing really significant. Okay, all right, so a little bit of background. The idea is this is the critical time. 1820 to 1830 is where Britain makes a shift, going away from a very conservative point of view to be more open. And so two guys, George Canning, who is the prime minister at this time, and Robert Peel, part of Parliament, they both gained influence in the 1820s. And so they are both Tories. So if you remember, Tories are the conservatives. However, Canning and Peel are both what we call reform-minded. Okay, reform-minded meaning that they're open to reform. They're young guys, and they are willing to discuss kind of what's best for the country. And so their approach to politics was that they are going to ally with some Whig reformers. So how do Tories and Whigs ever get along? It's like Democrats and Republicans. It doesn't make sense. Well, you can be a moderate conservative and you could be a moderate liberal. And so that's what we're seeing is that these Canning and Peel, being reform-minded, they are not staunch Tories, and they're working with very liberal Whigs or very moderate Whigs, and so they kind of like bringing back towards the middle, towards a more moderate point of view. But they don't always agree on everything, but certain points they do want to see change in. Okay, what makes really Great Britain significant and unique compared to the rest of the continent is kind of like just their philosophy and approach towards reform and change. Okay, so though not everything's perfect, right? Though there's a lot of political struggles and people are complaining and they're revolting in smaller ways, compared to what's really happening on the continent, it's really much more insignificant. I mean, it's much smaller. The demands that people are making are really important, but at the same time, it's not as violent. They don't have that point where they're resorting to that type of thing. And so many people felt that reform was really possible without revolution, that there could be a gradual process and there could be a patience that's implemented to see change instead of being super radical about it. Okay, this is also what we call the Victorian era. So basically from when Queen Victoria takes over from 1830s, right, 1837 to 1900, this is what we call the Victorian era. It's a very what we call peaceful reign, right? Nothing too transformative, nothing too revolutionary. Okay. Sorry, Victorian era, not Victoria era. Okay, so let's talk about Great Britain. So what enabled Britain in the first place was that they abandoned the Congress system. The Congress system is basically the concert of Europe, right? So the Congress system was a conservative group led by Metternich in saying that we are going to institute, right, the principles of intervention and just really maintaining the order, the balance of power, making sure that there aren't revolutions that are spreading that were going to, bring up, dictatorships like Napoleon again. So the fact that Britain abandoned it quite early, that in itself is kind of one of the first stepping stones. Okay, so from that they're able to then institute more open reforms that a lot of conservatives would not agree to. Right, so some of the reforms are they would change some of the laws towards crime and punishment, so the criminal code would be amended. Also, as far as labor unions, we talked about this, right? They're going to be open to labor unions where these unions can negotiate and bargain for their wages and working conditions and all that kind of stuff. They also started to institute what we call a police force. Okay, so if you guys have seen kind of like the old school British police in the 1800s, going to 1900s, they had those kind of like bowl hats and stuff. They're called bobbies. Okay, so by having a efficient police force that's in the city, a very metropolitan area, that was necessary because crime would go up when people are brought together and when people are struggling, they're desperate, they're going to, do evil and immoral things that could be stealing, killing, and there needs to be a police force to watch that. Okay. As far as religious reforms, one example is the Test Act in 1673 was repealed. Okay, repealed, and if you remember, this is a while ago, right? So this is like 150 years prior, and so they re-looked at this law and they said, hey, I don't think we should uphold this law anymore. So they repealed it. This originally banned non-Anglicans from office, so basically Catholics, right? Some Jews, I guess even some Puritans. No, not Puritans. Possibly Quakers, right? It really depends upon how they saw and how stringent they were. But now that this is repealed 150 years later, we're seeing that now these other types of even non-Protestant Christians can be part of political office. Okay, and the second one is the Catholic Emancipation Act. This is going to give Catholics full rights. So remember, there was a discrimination before, and so now in 1829, this is where they're recognized and seen and given those privileges. Okay, then the new Prime Minister comes to power, and his name is Charles Grey. The title he has is Earl Grey. That's kind of like, I guess, the nickname, the coined nickname. He is going to be prime minister from 1830 to 1834. He is the leader of the Whigs party, okay, and in working with the new English king, King George IV, they came up with a plan of how there could be kind of new government policies implemented. Okay, so the Whigs, though they are liberal, okay, most liberals are going to be supported by the middle class. The middle class, the bourgeoisie, the liberals, they want reform, they want change, in contrast to the working class. Okay, the working class are the radicals, right? They want immense change. They want to just bring democracy to everyone, right? The Whigs are a little bit more moderate compared to the radicalists, right? Then you have on the other side the conservatives, which are pretty much the monarch and also the nobility or the aristocracy, right? The rich upper class that are wealthy. As far as the middle or upper middle class, the bourgeoisie, they don't actually want to go down the radical route. Okay, they feel that it's way too extreme. They're not asking for that. They just want to keep their lives well, as kind of what the conservatives want, right, and that's what all the radicals want. So everyone wants what's best for them. That's good and fine. But that's just to understand their demographic, right? Those that supported the Whigs were mainly the bourgeoisie, middle to upper middle class. They weren't really open to the masses to gain the vote. Okay. But this is going to take time. It's going to take progress. One of the most critical milestones in British history, sorry, that's what I mentioned about the Whigs, is the Reform Bill of 1832. Okay, so the Reform Bill of 1832 was kind of that main legislation that was passed that really brought transformative change in terms of what the government will respond to. Right, people saw that cholera was breaking out, and that's where Edwin Chadwick wrote up his observations, and Parliament read upon it, and then they decided, hey, we need to make some changes. And so the Reform Bill is kind of rather dense in terms of everything it covers. Now, one of the main idea is really just the political participants, right? So how are voters being included? How are kind of the seats in the House of Commons versus the House of Lords going to be equally kind of balanced and stuff? And so let's first start talking about like how voting is done in England. Well, there are what we call different electoral districts, right? So if you live within this district, kind of like what we have, right? We're like District 29, like Walnut, but within your electoral district, you would have like a seat in the House of Lords, House of Commons, and so these are general districts or boroughs, and some of these areas that they set up originally a long time ago, centuries ago, these districts barely have any people anymore. And the reason why is because many of them have left and they've gone to the cities. And so these new industrial cities like Manchester, we talk about, right? They did not have the representation as they should have because everyone has flocked to these areas or to these industrial cities. The population is booming and they're not being represented. And that's a problem because there's many people there. They should have representation, whereas where there's no population, there shouldn't be representation as much there, right? So the Reform Bill of 1832 would basically eliminate these rotten boroughs, these rotten districts where the underpopulated rural electoral districts no longer will have as many representatives in Parliament, and so they typically would support the House of Lords because they're probably just the nobility, the aristocracy that had the land and lived in the rural countryside. And now they're being replaced with representatives from these manufacturing industrial cities that rose up during the Industrial Revolution. So because of the Industrial Revolution and population growth, all that good stuff, people are looking for better representation that needs to be fixed, and the Reform Bill aimed to do that, right? So eventually, Parliament is going to pass the Reform Bill, and factory owners and merchants are finally satisfied to some extent because they've been really asking for this for about 10 years. And This will double the number of voters that really focused on the middle class men. So middle class men that live in the cities, right, not in the countryside, but in the cities, are now able to participate in voting. And this is going to increase the number of voters from 6% of the population to 12% of the population, right? And that's kind of like, well, it's still really low. But the thing is that you have to understand that though the Reform Bill opened up voting for men, only about 1 in 5 men would be able to be eligible to vote, right? And so there's still a lot of controversy of like, oh, should voting be based upon your ownership of property, or should just because you're male or even female? But what we see is even up to this point, right? Britain, as a very kind of like a progressive, like looking country, workers, women, and the poor all did not have the eligibility to vote, right? So it's only 1 in 5 males because many of them are not part of what we call the middle class or the nobility, aristocracy. Okay, so the results of this, though, the impact is that before, between the two houses, House of Lords, House of Commons, the House of Lords kind of had its dominance, especially because how the electoral districts were set up. But after kind of like the changing of the borders of the districts, now the House of Commons has more a majority of the say and sway, the seating in Parliament compared to the House of Lords. So this is going to change kind of what types of policies is going to be putting out. Okay, all right. Last slide. So here we go. So other minor things that we've talked about before is the different factory acts, right? So the factory acts is like 1833. It talks about child labor and working conditions and hours and all that kind of stuff. That is part of the reforms that are happening at this very moment, and so they're kind of just like being punched out one by one, right? Children have to be a certain age, right? Certain sanitation conditions, all that kind of stuff. As far as slavery is going to be abolished by the British in 1833, and William Wilberforce is Parliament member who basically felt the conviction that as a Christian, he saw that slavery was sin in the eyes of God, and so that he wanted to overturn that. And eventually, where the British had slavery in the West Indies as one of their colonies, right, one of the places that they had taken over, they have gotten rid of that. Then we look at other laws that are passed. Okay, the Poor Law is passed where those that are unemployed, right, that need a job, but are healthy, can live in a workhouse. So they live there, but they also work there too. It's a government-run facility, and it's basically providing for the poor an opportunity. So this is kind of like helping out, right? Helping out, using government funds to help out the needy, those that are struggling, that were once part of possibly the working class, but no longer offered a job. Then you have the Mines Act. We talked about that in class a little bit, where child labor is no longer allowed in the coal mines. So we're seeing some changes here. And you have other acts like the 10-Hour Act that limited the work hours. Okay, I mentioned the Chartists a little bit too. Remember, just as a reminder, their ultimate goal was that they wanted to have definitely more equality in terms of the political balance of who can vote and how would certain rights be given to different social classes and stuff. The Chartists wanted universal suffrage, right? They believe in a pure democracy where every man should be able to vote because it doesn't matter if you own property or not. Okay, so they are seeing, some of the things that the Chartists introduced early on were taken into account in the Reform Bill of 1832. However, when they started, we mentioned how they saw a lot of failures, right? Later on, after the Reform Bill of 1832, this is where eventually all males will have universal suffrage, and so it's going to take that time, and then finally we're going to see women be able to gain the vote as well. Okay, economic types of reforms. We're going to see that the Corn Laws that were once very much held to a centralized economy corn prices were set by the government to protect the corn and grain and wheat of British farmers, and so it's a very mercantilist approach. But what happens with the corn laws being repealed means that the government is no longer going to be putting high tariffs on, let's say, French or German or Spanish or whatever, okay, Dutch types of corn that was imported. So the issue was, sorry, this is backtracking a little bit. The issue was that in order to protect prices of and just the success of British farmers, you tax the imported crops. By taxing them, it's more expensive for the people, and people are complaining about that. So you two guys, you have Richard Cobden and John Bright that are part of the Anti-Corn Law League, and basically they want lower food prices, and in order to do so, they believe that we should import some grains or crops from other countries because they offer it to a cheaper rate. The issue of why they're so for lower food prices is because mainly of the certain famines that were going on in the United Kingdom. So you guys remember I mentioned the Irish potato famine that happened in the 1840s. Because there's a lack of food, then prices are going to go up even more. So basically, the government needs to respond to the demands of the people that are saying we want lower prices on food. We can't afford food. Do something about it. You should then repeal the corn laws, right? So that's where the Anti-Corn Law League comes in. Lastly is some old laws called the Navigation Acts, which we talked about way back when with Oliver Cromwell. Okay, so with Oliver Cromwell back in the English Civil War in the 1650s, this is where the navigation laws, right, prohibited the trading and shipping of goods to British colonies from foreign states, foreign nations, right? And so this is what they signify as the official end of mercantilist policies in Great Britain. Okay, and so the navigation laws are now repealed as well in 1849. So you can see this kind of the shift now, this transformation in direction in terms of the policies they had. They're now changed to go in a different direction.